Hello everyone. Today we're going to cover chapter 1 titled Pharmacokinetics, How Drugs Are Handled by the Body. In this chapter we're going to learn about the movement of drug molecules into, through, and out of the body. We are going to learn about which ways drugs get into the body and how that relates to their reactions. And once they're in the body, how do they get to the sites at which they produce their effects? Once they exert their effect, how is that action terminated? And finally, how does the body develop drug tolerance? Have you ever taken aspirin or Motrin and noticed that you have to keep on repeating the dosage? You normally have to take it every 4 to 6 hours. Why do you think you have to keep on repeating the dosage? Why isn't one dosage enough? This has to do with its pharmacokinetics, and the pharmacokinetics is a time course of a drug's action from the moment it was first taken to the duration of the effect. And so basically, it's like the rise and fall of the drug's concentration. Initially, the same exact drug can have a different effect on the body depending on the way it was taken. So for example, if the drug was taken by inhalation, let's just say it was cocaine, and you could smoke it or you could inject it. This is the quickest route to the bloodstream, and so the concentration would be highest with these routes. But notice that it has a shorter duration of time. So after a short amount of time, the concentration drops off. Whereas if cocaine was snorted or ingested, like eaten basically, then the concentration would be a lot less. So if you notice, the concentration is about half the amount of if it was inhaled or injected. And we're going to talk about like why the concentrations are less in these routes of administration, like later on in this lecture. But notice that it takes longer for the drug to enter the bloodstream and less concentration, but the duration of the drug is much longer. Same thing with ingestion. So, for example, marijuana can be smoked or it can be eaten as an edible. If it's smoked, then the high will last about 1 to 3 hours and it'll be strongest in 15 minutes. And that's because inhalation gets into the bloodstream the quickest. And if it gets into the bloodstream, then it can go straight to the brain the quickest as well. However, an edible, the high will last a lot longer just because you get some of the THC, which is the active ingredient. You'll be receiving it in your bloodstream in short amounts over a longer period of time through digestion. And so the strongest effect will be within 2 to 3 hours. And so eating it means that it has to go through the intestines, then through the liver, and finally make it to the bloodstream. And so this whole process takes a lot longer and therefore can exert different effects depending on how it was taken. So what we're going to do is focus on something that's called ADME. And this is something that I want you to memorize because you're going to use it for your essay that you're going to write later in the semester. So I'm going to have you write an essay about a drug that we haven't heard of. And you'll need to explain what is called the ADME, and it's an abbreviation, and we'll look at what it means in a second, but it refers to the bioavailability of the drug. And so A stands for absorption. In other words, how drug molecules get into the bloodstream. So what is the route of administration? Is it inhaled? Is it injected? Etc. Distribution is how the drug molecule is spread throughout the body once it's inside of the body, once it's in the bloodstream. How does it spread? Metabolism is how the drug is broken down into waste. And elimination is the actual process of expelling the drug out of the body, which can be done in several ways. So we're going to talk about each one in detail. And so this is something that I want you to be familiar with. And for short, it's called ADME. First, let's talk about absorption. Absorption is basically the route of administration. How does the drug get into your body? And there are enteral routes, which includes the digestive system, and parenteral routes, which are basically everything but the digestive system. So it can be done through injection, inhalation, absorption to the skin, or through mucous membranes. Drugs that are orally administered, meaning that they are eaten, first passes through the esophagus and then through the stomach to the small and large intestine, next through the liver, so it is filtered by the liver, and then it finally enters the bloodstream. And once it's in the bloodstream, now it has access to the brain. But it needs to go through all of these processes first. And so, in order for the drug to be effective, it can't be destroyed by the stomach acids. And so, within our stomach, we have a lot of acids and a lot of enzymes that break down all kinds of different molecules. And so that's why, and inevitably, uh, a lot of different types of drugs do get broken down in the stomach because of this. And so that's why you don't get as high of a concentration in your bloodstream as you would if you were to smoke it or inject it. And so also when drug molecules enter the intestine and penetrate the lining of the stomach, they must be able to pass through the tissues as well through passive diffusion. And so the ones that do best are the ones that have lipids on them, because remember we talked about lipid soluble. We talked about nonpolar molecules, which can easily pass through membranes. So those are usually the molecules that can make it through the digestive system and into the bloodstream. And so they must be lipid soluble, nonpolar, and somewhat small in size. The disadvantages of taking drugs this way is basically the side effects. So, for example, for some people, it may be too toxic and it'll cause vomiting and stomach distress. It's also hard to know how much drug will be absorbed into the bloodstream, so how much of it will be effective. And the stomach acids tend to destroy some of the drug. First pass metabolism refers to the drug molecules being filtered by the liver. And so the liver is an accessory organ of the digestive system. And what it does is it filters basically the all of the molecules and everything exiting from the digestive system to make sure that it is safe to enter the bloodstream. And so inevitably the liver has a lot of different types of enzymes to break down things that shouldn't be in the bloodstream. And also the majority of your drugs are metabolized in the liver. So in order for the drug to be effective, it must be able to bypass the liver's effects on it. And so one enzyme example is called alcohol dehydrogenase. And it is basically an enzyme that breaks down alcohol. And so that's why over time, when you first drink alcohol, it can actually pass through the membranes of your digestive system really easily into the bloodstream. But it continuously gets filtered over and over again in the liver, and it is broken down. And so after some time, the alcohol no longer has an effect on you, and so you need to drink more in order for you to feel the same effect again. About 75% of the drug orally taken ends up making it into the bloodstream, and that usually takes about 1 to 3 hours after it's been eaten. And so there are different types of oral dosage forms. There are tablets, capsules, liquid, solutions, suspensions, syrups, and elixirs. Another form of administration is called rectal administration, which is the insertion of the drug through the anus, and that immediately enters into the bloodstream. Absorption in this case is irregular and unpredictable, and it can definitely enter the bloodstream in high concentrations if administered this way. In a clinical setting, this is usually done when the patient is vomiting, unconscious, or unable to swallow. Another route of administration is by inhalation. This is popular for recreational drugs such as tobacco, marijuana, crack cocaine, methamphetamine, smoked heroin. How the drug is administered is that it enters the lung tissues first, and so the lung tissues have a large surface area, and this allows for rapid absorption into the bloodstream. So we go from the lungs straight into the bloodstream, and so this route of administration allows for a higher concentration to enter into the blood quite quickly. And that also means that the effect lasts for a shorter amount of time. And so, as the drug enters the lungs, it is sent to the heart and pumped into the rest of the body. Really rapid absorption takes as long as 1 to 2 minutes, so that's pretty quick. Another route of administration is through the mucous membranes. And so this can be done through the mouth or nose. For example, like rubbing cocaine powder on the gums of the mouth or when it's snorted. And so this effect is really quick too, just as quick as inhalation. The concentration in this case is pretty high too. What it does is that it enters into the bloodstream through the mucous membranes. And so there are capillaries. And we talked about capillaries when we were talking about the circulatory system, which basically provide nutrients to the cells and also can take anything from the cells back into the blood. And so we go straight from the mucous membranes into the capillaries, which then immediately enter into the blood in about 2 minutes. And so cocaine powder, when sniffed, attaches to the membranes inside of the nose and is absorbed directly into the bloodstream. Nicotine nasal spray or chewing gum is absorbed to the mucous membranes as well, and then from that route goes directly into the bloodstream. Mucous membranes are considered natural openings in the nose, mouth, trachea, and esophagus, and there are membranes there that basically produce mucus, and so mucus tends to trap any type of foreign objects that enter into the system. And so these areas are lined with these little finger-like projections called cilia, which help move things up and down the membranes. Another route of administration is through the skin. And so drugs can be taken directly through the skin by transdermal patches, and they can provide continuous controlled release over time. And so birth control, there's certain types of birth control that are taken that way. There are nicotine patches that work in that way as well. And so this allows for slow, continuous absorption over hours or days, minimizing the side effects. Examples: fentanyl, nicotine, estrogen, these are hormone patches, scopolamine for motion sickness, methylphenidate, which is basically a drug for children that have ADHD. And so, in order for the blood to enter into the bloodstream through the blood vessels, first it needs to go to the skin. And we know that the cell membranes of tissues are lipid soluble. And so, these molecules need to be lipid soluble as well so that they can pass through passive diffusion. Another route of administration is by injection. And so, this injection can be straight into the vein. In this case, this is the way in which the drug is received at the highest concentration. And, going from a really high concentration straight into the bloodstream, straight to the brain causes the highest effect. And that's why it also has the most severe side effects. And it's also the most lethal route of injection. So this dosage can be, in this case, extremely precise. And it's the fastest route of administration out of all of them. This is how it gets into your bloodstream and your brain the quickest. But of course, disadvantages: rapid rate of absorption leaves little time to respond to a drug overdose. Needs to use clean needles. And so AIDS and hepatitis have been transferred through drug use by having infected needles. And once the blood enters the bloodstream, you can't remove it. And so if you're going through like some type of toxic overdose, it's nearly impossible to remove it out of the blood. You can't vomit it since you didn't eat it. And so this also is very prone to causing allergic reactions and blood clots because of incomplete solubilization, which means that it isn't completely broken down. And so there are different types of injections. There's intramuscular, which is injecting into the muscles; subcutaneous, which is like right in the skin layers; and intravenous, which is basically straight into the vein. And this type of injection right here is the one that is the fastest route to the bloodstream, since it's directly into the blood. and also received in the highest concentration. And so muscular and dermal still needs to pass through the membranes before it makes it into the bloodstream. So there are lower concentrations that end up in the bloodstream through this method. All right, so let's talk about the next one, which is distribution. Remember, this is ADME, so we discussed A, absorption, which were different routes of administration. Now we're going to talk about once it's in the bloodstream, how does it spread around? How does it spread to other tissues? Drug distribution refers to the drug molecules that are absorbed into the bloodstream and circulate the body to make it to basically cross certain barriers to reach all of its targets, so that whether that's the tissues of the body or to the brain, and the brain where it causes the most psychoactive effects. And so drug distribution has to do with the way that drugs are circulated through the bloodstream, and also how they are circulated through the cerebral spinal fluid. And this is a fluid that is in the brain. The brain does not have blood. It has its own type of blood called cerebral spinal fluid, but it is not the same as the blood that we see in the pictures, or when you cut yourself and it looks red. Not that blood. It's a whole different type. And side effects, just in case you didn't know, the reason why certain drugs cause side effects is because they continue to circulate outside of the brain, and they don't contribute to its effect, to its psychoactive effect. So if it's not contributing there, it may be indirectly targeting other tissues in your body and causing effects on them. All right, so once the drug is in the bloodstream, it's basically available to reach its target site. Since we know that the blood is responsible for carrying nutrients and oxygen to cells, it can also carry drug molecules to cells and any waste away from cells to be excreted by the kidneys. And so in an average sized adult, blood circulates in the body once every minute. And so that means that the delivery of nutrients and the delivery of drug molecules can happen once every minute. Blood flows through capillaries where nutrients and drugs are exchanged with the cells. And so these bigger looking tubes here are veins and arteries, but they branch out into even smaller and smaller and smaller components throughout the body, which are the capillaries, and that's where the exchange of nutrients happens with the cells. And so after the blood circulates from the pulmonary vessels, which is the area towards the lungs, it returns to the left side of the heart, and then it travels straight to the brain, from the aorta to the brain and the body. And so basically, the bloodstream is responsible for not only circulating drug molecules throughout the body, but it also is a muscle that pumps the blood into the brain. And remember, we said there's no blood in the brain, so there's an exchange between the blood and the cerebral spinal fluid, and then the molecules end up entering the brain. And so once the blood makes this exchange with the cerebral spinal fluid, then the drug molecules enter into the brain through this fluid. And so cerebral spinal fluid is the watery liquid that surrounds the brain and spinal cord, only circulates nutrients and chemical substances filtered from the blood. And so the brain is very sensitive, and it needs to be protected. And so that's why it has cerebral spinal fluid to protect it. And so it basically protects the brain and spinal cord from trauma. So if there's any impact, the impact can be taken from the outer portion of the brain. It just like blood, it supplies nutrients to the nervous system tissues. Well, it provides nutrients to tissues, but in this case, the cerebral spinal fluid is very specific to the nervous system. And it also removes waste products from the cerebral metabolism. So all of the chemical reactions that are going on in your brain, all of the waste products that are no longer needed, are also filtered to the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, there are body membranes that affect drug distribution. So as these drug molecules are being distributed to their target sites through the cells, they need to pass other barriers as well, which are the cell membranes, capillary walls, the blood-brain barrier, and the placental barrier. So all of these right here represent, sorry, I have three on here, but it's actually four membranes, my bad. But all of these here represent membranes that are like barriers that can reduce the effect and the amount and the concentration that ends up being effective. And so it's kind of like having hurdles to overcome. The membranes provide hurdles. It's not like a straightforward path to the brain. It has to overcome these obstacles in order to make it to the final destination, let's say. And so the cell membrane we know is made up of a phospholipid bilayer, which is mostly nonpolar, okay, mostly made up of fats that have no net charges. And because of that, it makes it easy for any small lipid soluble molecules to enter. So any small molecules that are nonpolar can have an easier time entering through the cell membrane by passive diffusion. But it also is like a barrier to the distribution of other drugs. And so those are normally the water soluble type of drugs. And the membranes that drug molecules have to overcome just depends on the route of administration. But if it's orally taken, then it has to overcome the stomach to the intestine and to the bloodstream. And so the membranes there can reduce the concentration before it enters the bloodstream. It also ends up being, it also needs to pass through the kidneys. But some of the, actually, the majority of lipid soluble molecules, and it happens to be that a lot of psychoactive drugs are lipid soluble, they don't end up leaving the kidney very easily. They end up coming back into the bloodstream. And the drug molecules have to overcome the barrier, basically the fluid that closely surrounds tissue cells, into the interior of other cells. And so these membranes basically are kind of like barriers that these drug molecules need to overcome before they enter into the bloodstream. And so that's why you end up seeing reduced concentrations of drug once they have to pass through membranes. The capillaries is also another one. So as drugs are being transported around in the blood, they eventually go through the capillaries and end up being passed on to either the cerebrospinal fluid or the cells in your body. The capillaries that are that surround your body, they actually have these little tiny pores in them. And so these tiny pores right here are anywhere between 90 to 150 angstroms wide, which is larger than most drugs. Therefore, drugs can easily pass through the capillaries to cell tissues. And so the transport of drugs is done this way, especially if it's lipid soluble, it can pass quite easily. However, the proteins in the blood and the blood cells, they're much too large for them to be able to come through these pores. And so that's why you don't end up losing any proteins or blood cells by this method, because the pores are too small, and those and the cells and the proteins are just too large. In some cases, it's interesting, but there are some proteins in the blood that actually end up binding onto the drug, and that makes the drug less effective. And so if you have a protein binding to a drug, that drug can no longer pass through these pores and cannot have an effect. Since the brain is the organ that needs the most energy, blood flow is greatest to the brain, and more so than to the bones, joints, and fat deposits. And so that means that the drug molecules reaches the brain in higher concentrations than the rest of the body. For example, when marijuana is first smoked, the active part of it, THC, reaches the brain within a minute and increases in concentration within 30 minutes. And about an hour after, it drops off in concentration simply because it is broken down, it is metabolized. The brain is protected by something that is called the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is like a fence that keeps out unwanted things, unwanted molecules out of the brain. So if you remember when we talked about capillaries earlier, we said that the capillaries have a lot of pores in them in which drugs can easily diffuse out of them. But that's not the case in the brain. The drug capillaries have an extra barrier. And so glial cells, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, protect those like leaks, those holes, and it prevents molecules just from easily flowing through because the brain is just so much more protected. And so the brain has a greater risk for, or a greater need for nutrients and oxygen. That also increases the risk of toxic danger. So if it has a greater need from the blood, it also has to protect itself from receiving bad chemicals and molecules from the blood. And so the solution to that is to create a blood-brain barrier. And basically, the capillaries just can't easily diffuse molecules into the brain. The blood-brain barrier basically are these glial cells, and if you remember, we talked about glial cells in the last chapter being a type of brain cell. And so these glial cells, they cover the blood vessels and basically cover the pores so that molecules just don't easily diffuse out. So in order for something to be able to reach the brain, it has to be able to diffuse through these membranes, through the blood-brain barrier and through the glial cells. And so mostly lipid soluble, the nonpolar small molecules are the ones that have the easiest time getting straight through. So what kind of molecules pass through the blood-brain barrier? And so it has to pass through the walls of the capillaries and the membranes of the glial cells, so I just said that. The type of drugs that pass through tend to be smaller in size, so small drugs, rapid penetration, as long as they are nonpolar. And the larger drugs, just in general, have poorer penetration, so they need an extra transporter or another way to get into the brain. And there are certain proteins in the blood, like I had mentioned earlier, that bind onto molecules, big molecules like drugs, and prevent them from going through the pore. And so it makes it that much harder for the drug to reach the brain, and so it gets into the brain in lower concentrations. Drug molecules can also easily penetrate the placental barrier, which is basically the membrane that separates the baby from the mother. However, the baby can receive nutrients through the placenta and can also exchange waste and back to the mother so that she can excrete them through the placenta. And so even though there's membrane barriers here, drugs can still pass through as long as they have the criteria of being small enough and lipid soluble. And so fat-soluble substances, including all psychoactive drugs, diffuse readily without any limitations through the placental barrier. Now let's talk about the third of ADME. So this is ADM, which is metabolism, and that is the breakdown of the drug molecule into a waste product. And so once a drug molecule is broken down, it is no longer in its active form, and if it's not in its active form, then it can't really exert its effects on the brain or on the body. And so drug metabolism is basically drugs that have been transformed to metabolites, so into smaller pieces that are actually more water soluble at this point. And so this is done by enzymes. And so enzymes are very good at breaking down things or building them up, but in this case, they are changing the form of the active molecule to an inactive form. And not only that, it's also changing it into a more polar molecule so that it can easily diffuse through the urine and pass through the liquids and be able to escape the body. And so, for example, THC, which is an active ingredient in marijuana, when it's metabolized, it is formed into a molecule called carboxy-THC. And this carboxy-THC is no longer active, and so it cannot exert its effects anymore. And it's more water soluble, and so it's way less nonpolar. Now it's more polar, and that makes it a lot more easier to be excreted through the urine since it's soluble. And another metabolite, for example, when cocaine is broken down, is called benzoylcognine, which is just basically another type of form of cocaine that is inactive Well, it's no longer cocaine since the molecule is broken down, but it's broken down to a form that cannot harm the body anymore. It cannot have any effect on the body and is more polar, so that way it can easily be excreted through the urine. And so, where is it that drugs are getting metabolized? Well, the majority of drugs are metabolized by the liver, and specifically these group of enzymes that are called cytochrome P450 enzymes. These basically are largely responsible for breaking down about 50% of psychoactive drugs taken, especially the ones that are lipophilic, which is mostly nonpolar, which is mostly non-water soluble, like we've been talking about over and over and over again. And so it breaks them down into smaller molecules that are more polar, meaning that they're more water soluble, so that they can easily be transported through the urine and out of the body. And so, interestingly, genetics play a role in drug metabolism. For example, populations have different genetic variation, and some populations can produce just a normal amount, let's say, of cytochrome P450. And then you'll have another group that produces too little of the enzyme, and so it'll take that much longer to metabolize the drug, and the effect will last longer in them. And then there are other people that produce too much of the enzyme, and basically the drug doesn't have that much of an effect on them, or it gets metabolized so quickly that they need more just to compensate for the feeling of it lasting longer. Now, I have a friend who actually could never get drunk, no matter how much alcohol she drank. She just couldn't get drunk. And so she's one of those that has a lot of metabolizing enzyme, but in that case, probably alcohol dehydrogenase, but she probably makes so much that the alcohol molecule is broken down so quickly and it just can't have an effect. This is also important to analyze when it comes to taking therapeutic drugs, for example, like antidepressants. Depending on what type of genetic variation you have, some antidepressants may not have an effect on you or may be too strong on you. And so that way, the dosage can either be increased or decreased depending on what type of metabolizer you are. Now, as a result, if the liver is overworked from continuously metabolizing the abusive drugs, then that can lead to something called cirrhosis, which is the scarring of liver because it's being overworked. And so this is a critical disease seen in people who have chronic alcoholism, for example, but also other chronic drug users go through this. All right, now let's talk about the last one of ADME, which is elimination. So now that we talked about how the drugs are absorbed, which is the route in which they are taken, how they are distributed through the body, which is through the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid, and how they are metabolized, and we talk about the metabolism of drugs through the liver. Now there's many other ways that drugs can be metabolized, but I only touched on certain enzymes that are found in the liver. Now we're going to talk about how they are excreted out of the body, so they're no longer active. And so the waste products of drugs can be excreted in different ways, but mostly they're excreted through the urine. And so the kidneys are involved in drug elimination because the kidneys are the ones responsible for making urine, which is basically the waste products of our cells, basically eliminating them out of our body since our body no longer needs them. So the major function of kidneys is to excrete most metabolic products and regulate the levels of substances in our body fluids. And so all of this filtration happens in this place called the Bowman's capsule, and it's basically the all of the little capillaries and all the tubules actually that are found in the Bowman's capsule, and that those little concentrated areas are responsible for filtering 1 liter per minute of blood. And so basically most of the molecules that are in the blood are actually reabsorbed, they're kept. So it's a way to prevent them from leaving the body. However, a very small percentage of every single filtration is nothing but waste, and so the kidneys are responsible for getting rid of that, from expelling it out of the body. And so this is one of the most common ways in which drugs are excreted. Now, if the drug is not broken down, if it's in its lipid soluble form, then it won't be excreted by the lungs. It'll just enter the bloodstream. It's until it's metabolized by enzymes into smaller products that are more polar. When it's finally metabolized by enzymes, then the kidneys can get rid of it to the urine. So basically, drug molecules have to be water soluble in order for them to be eliminated by the urine. And so there are some drugs that are naturally polar, that are naturally water soluble, which don't need enzymes to break them down, meaning that you can just urinate them without them being broken down at all. And the chronic abuse of drugs and alcohol and just other types of drugs, right, can also cause severe kidney damage just from simply being overused, just from having to filter these drugs over and over and over again. It can cause tissue damage and even kidney failure. Another way, or several ways, in which drugs can be excreted, but in much smaller quantities, so these are not the dominant ways, but yet still ways in which the drugs can escape the body, is through the bile, skin, and also exhalation, so just by breathing out the drug molecule. Now, if it goes through the bile is made from in the liver, and so the liver basically excretes the bile along with the drug molecule to the gut so that it can be excreted out as waste. And drugs can also penetrate through the skin. And so some of those are benzoic acid, salicylic acid, alcohol, heavy metals, like arsenic and mercury are also excreted. And so sometimes you can kind of smell an odor in heavy users. Like, for example, people who drink a lot of alcohol, you can kind of smell it penetrating through their skin. And other methods are by exhalation. And so you can just breathe out some of the drug molecules out into the environment to get rid of it from your body. All right, so now that we are done with ADME, we covered the ADME. Let's move on to the last question from what I initially proposed, which was how does the body develop drug tolerance? So let's talk about drug tolerance and dependence. And so drug tolerance is a state of progressively decreasing responsiveness to the same dose of a drug. And so a person who develops tolerance needs a large dose of the drug to achieve the effect originally obtained by a smaller dose, meaning that you need more and more and more over time. And drug dependence is the need of the drug to avoid withdrawal symptoms. So let's talk about the categories of drug tolerance and drug dependence, which is metabolic tolerance, reverse tolerance, behavioral conditioning, and physical dependence. And sorry, this should be 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know how that skipped there, but I'll try to fix that. All right, metabolic tolerance. And so metabolic tolerance is the body adapting to excess drug. And how does it do that? Well, it does that in several ways. One way is to reduce the number of receptors available to the drug. And so if there are less receptors, and I'm talking about the neurons. So if you remember, we talked about neurotransmitters and how neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft, and then they stimulate the postsynaptic neuron by receptors. And so we're talking about those type of receptors. If there's less receptors around, then the drug can't stimulate it as much as it normally could. And another way is by increasing the number of enzymes to break down the drug, which makes sense. So if you have more enzyme, the drug gets broken down faster. And so when this happens, higher levels of drugs are needed to have the same effect. Just to give an example of metabolic tolerance with the reduction of receptors, this here, you've seen this picture quite a bit of times by now, is the presynaptic neuron, and these are the neurotransmitters. And as you notice, the neurotransmitters are being released and they stimulate these receptors. However, if the neurons start downregulating the receptors, meaning that they make less, it takes that much more drug to stimulate the receptors to get the same effect. And so now you need much more drug to be able to produce the same effect since there's less receptors. All right, let's talk about reverse tolerance. And this is actually the opposite of drug tolerance. This is actually an amplified response to a drug after using it once. And so this happens with cocaine and ecstasy. So you use it once, and the next time you use it, it actually amplifies the effect. So that's an interesting type of tolerance, which is called reverse tolerance. And then there's behavioral conditioning. And so in this case, drug tolerance is not developed by a chemical dependence. Instead, it's psychological. And so it has to do with the type of stimulus that it is paired with. And so wherever the drug is taken and the environment that you were in, that alone can cause you to develop some type of tolerance. And so, for example, some examples of drug tolerance are always smoking during work breaks. So after a while, your brain can develop a dependence on wanting to do that behavior, which then leads to tolerance. And another example is drugs that are used, let's say for sleep, or people use drugs when they're stressed. And so all of those right there, all of that behavioral conditioning can cause a person to become more tolerant, interestingly. And what I mean by tolerant is that conditioning alone can cause you to need more to be able to stimulate the same effect. So this is not a chemical dependence, but yet you'll still need more drug to be able to stimulate the same effect in you, just because it's psychologically, just because you are psychologically dependent. All right, and the last one is physical dependence, which in this case, the drug is taken to avoid withdrawal symptoms. The withdrawal symptom is called abstinence symptom. And so these can basically lead to reactions of the body due to the lack of drug, like illness, pain, and vomiting. For example, severe alcohol users develop convulsions. And so that's your body developing a reaction because the drug is no longer there. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you are addicted. So that's not a sign of addiction. That's just a sign that your brain and body chemistry have been altered by these drugs. And so, yeah, you also see it with heroin addiction. A person gets very sick when they're not using. But this can also happen with drugs that are prescribed by doctors, like, for example, SSRIs, which are antidepressants. If you stop taking an antidepressant just out of nowhere without tapering off of it, without taking less and less over time, that can also cause an abstinence symptom in you. And so that can also lead to withdrawal symptoms. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're addicted to the antidepressant. Okay, this sums up our chapter 1. Now remember, chapter 1, when you read it, you'll notice there's a lot more information than what I have given you. And so I cut out some of the information that I didn't think was important. Well, not that it's not important, but important for you to memorize for an exam. I still suggest that you read everything. It's quite interesting, but you're only responsible for the information that I present to you and what I put on my study guide.